It was supposed to be a quiet shift, the kind that dragged on with the monotony of fluorescent lights and the low hum of vending machines. Sam had worked at the overnight gas station for years, and while it wasn't glamorous, it paid the bills. It was the kind of job that gave you solitude, an uninterrupted stretch of hours to think or simply zone out. But Sam learned quickly that solitude was often an illusion. It started a little past midnight. The wind outside had picked up, whistling through the gaps in the station doors. Sam was behind the counter, scrolling through news articles on his phone when the bell above the door jingled. He looked up to see a man enter, his silhouette framed against the eerie glow of the streetlights. The man was tall and gaunt, wearing a weathered coat that hung loosely from his shoulders. His eyes didn't meet Sam's as he shuffled in, his head tilting unnaturally to one side. "Evening," Sam said, trying to sound cheerful. The man didn't respond. He moved slowly through the aisles, his footsteps soft but deliberate, as if he were trying not to disturb something unseen. Sam felt a prickle of unease, but forced himself to shake it off. He dealt with all kinds of customers on the night shift: drunks, insomniacs, wanderers. This was just another oddball. But then the man stopped in the middle of an aisle, standing perfectly still. Sam squinted, trying to see what he was doing. His back was turned, but there was something unnatural about the way he stood, his head twitching slightly. Sam leaned over the counter. "You need any help, buddy?" The man slowly turned his head, his face still obscured by the dim light. Then, without a word, he turned and walked straight toward the restroom at the back of the store. Sam sighed. He hated when people used the restroom without asking, but he didn't feel like starting a confrontation. Instead, he waited. 5 minutes passed. Then 10, then 20. Annoyance turned to concern. Sam grabbed the keys to the restroom and walked to the back of the store, his footsteps echoing in the silence. He knocked on the door. "Hey, you okay in there?" No response. He knocked again, louder. "Sir, if you don't come out, I'm going to have to open the door." Silence. With a deep breath, Sam unlocked the door and swung it open. The restroom was empty, completely empty. The air inside was cold and damp, as if someone had left a window open. But the single frosted window above the sink was locked shut. Sam stood frozen in the doorway, his heart pounding. He had watched the man walk in. He hadn't seen him leave. The sound of the bell above the door jolted him back to reality. He spun around, hurrying back to the front of the store, but when he reached the counter, there was no one there. The door was closed, and the security camera feed showed nothing but an empty parking lot. Sam's hands were shaking as he rewound the footage. There it was. The man walking into the store, his movements slow and deliberate. But when Sam fast-forwarded to the point where the man had entered the restroom, the footage cut to static. It stayed that way for several minutes before resuming, showing Sam standing at the counter alone. He stared at the screen, his mind racing. Maybe it was a glitch. Maybe he was just overtired. But when he looked down, his blood ran cold. On the counter in front of him, where the man had stood earlier, was a single, wet handprint. The rest of the shift passed in a blur. Sam tried to focus on his work, but every sound, every creak, every gust of wind set him on edge. He couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. At one point, he thought he saw a shadow move across the parking lot. But when he stepped outside, the lot was empty. When dawn finally broke, Sam was exhausted. As he locked up the station and walked to his car, he felt the weight of the night pressing down on him. He slid into the driver's seat, started the engine, and glanced in the rearview mirror. There, sitting in the back seat, was the man. His head tilted unnaturally to the side, his eyes locked on Sam's. The scream that tore from Sam's throat was drowned out by the sound of the engine roaring to life. When he whipped around to look, the back seat was empty. Trembling, he sped out of the parking lot, vowing to never take another night shift again. But the nightmare didn't end there. For weeks after, Sam would wake up in the middle of the night, heart racing, convinced he wasn't alone in his apartment. Objects would move on their own, lights would flicker, and sometimes, just as he was drifting off to sleep, he'd hear the faint jingle of the gas station doorbell echoing in his ears. And in the morning, he'd always find a single wet handprint on his bedroom mirror. The clock struck 2:13 a.m., and Clara glanced at the time, her stomach tightening. She had been warned about the graveyard shift at the old hospital, but she dismissed the stories as exaggerations. It was just an old building, she told herself. creaky and filled with drafts. But now, standing alone in the dimly lit ward with only the hum of fluorescent lights for company, she wasn't so sure. Clara's job was simple: monitor the patient in room 909, a long abandoned room at the end of the hall. The hospital wasn't busy enough to need it anymore, but administration insisted she do routine checks because, according to them, is protocol. The room's history was murky. Clara had overheard whispers among the other nurses about tragic deaths and hauntings. One nurse swore she had seen the figure of a woman in the window late at night, though the room had been locked for years. Clara brushed the thoughts away. She was a professional. Ghost stories were for kids. The corridor leading to room 909 felt longer than usual that night. The air seemed heavier, and the shadows seemed darker. The wheels of her medication cart squeaked as she pushed it along the polished floors, the sound echoing unnervingly. When she reached the door to 909, she hesitated. Her pulse quickened as she fumbled with the key. Why was she so nervous? The lock clicked, and the door creaked open. The room was pitch black. Clara flicked on her flashlight and swept the beam across the space. Nothing was out of the ordinary, just an old hospital bed with a stained mattress, peeling wallpaper, and a single chair in the corner. She stepped inside, her shoes making dull thuds on the linoleum. As she approached the bed, she felt a chill run down her spine, as if someone had just exhaled behind her. "Stop it," she muttered under her breath. She scanned the room one last time before stepping back into the hallway, relieved to be out of the oppressive darkness. That's when she heard it, a faint rustling sound like fabric shifting against fabric. She froze, turning slowly toward the open door of room 909. The sound stopped. Her heart was pounding, her breath shallow. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. There was no response. Clara debated calling security, but she knew they'd laugh at her. Gathering her courage, she stepped back into the room and shone her flashlight around. The bed was empty. The chair in the corner was undisturbed. She turned to leave, but as she did, her flashlight flickered and died, plunging her into darkness. Her hand flew to her pocket, fumbling for her phone. As she activated the flashlight app, a new sound made her blood run cold. Slow, deliberate breathing. It wasn't hers. Clara's flashlight illuminated the bed again, but this time, it wasn't empty. A figure was lying there. A woman, her face pale and expressionless, her eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. The woman's mouth was open slightly, emitting shallow, raspy breaths. Clara staggered backward, nearly tripping over her own feet. "Ma'am, are you okay?" Clara stammered, instinctively reaching for the emergency button on the wall. But the moment her fingers grazed it, the woman's head snapped toward her, and she let out a blood-curdling scream that seemed to echo endlessly. Clara bolted out of the room, slamming the door behind her and racing down the hallway. She didn't stop until she reached the nurse's station, where her colleague Greg was dozing off in a chair. "What's wrong?" Greg asked, startled awake by her panicked arrival. There's someone in room 909, Clara gasped, clutching at her chest. Greg frowned. "That's not possible. That room's been empty for years. No one has the key except us." "I saw her," Clara insisted. "She was on the bed, breathing, staring at me. She screamed." Greg hesitated, then sighed and grabbed his flashlight. "Stay here. I'll check it out." Clara didn't want to let him go, but her legs felt like lead. She watched as he disappeared down the hallway, his figure growing smaller and smaller until it was swallowed by the shadows. Minutes passed. Clara strained to hear anything. Footsteps, a shout, anything. But the silence was absolute. Finally, she couldn't take it anymore. She grabbed her phone and walked cautiously down the corridor. When she reached room 909, the door was ajar. "Greg?" She called out, her voice shaking. There was no answer. She pushed the door open and shone her light inside. The room was empty. Her heart dropped. She turned to leave, but as she stepped back into the hall, the door slammed shut behind her with a deafening bang. Clara screamed and tugged at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Suddenly, the light in the room flickered on, illuminating the bed. Greg was lying there, his eyes wide open, his face contorted in a frozen expression of terror. Above him, scrawled across the walls in what looked like blood, were the words, "You can't leave." Clara's scream was the last sound she ever made. When the morning staff arrived, they found room 909 locked from the inside. Both Clara and Greg were missing, and no trace of them was ever found. But on the hospital security footage at precisely 2:13 a.m., you can see the door to room 909 creak open on its own. And just for a moment, a pale face peeks out. watching. It was just another routine delivery. Ryan worked for a small courier company, taking packages to remote locations no one else wanted to bother with. The money was good, and the solitude didn't bother him. Tonight's delivery was a bit different. An old farmhouse deep in the countryside, surrounded by miles of desolate fields and thick woods. The instructions were clear. Deliver the package to the address, place it on the porch, knock twice, and leave immediately. No signatures required, no face-to-face interaction. It sounded easy enough, but as Ryan drove further into the night, a gnawing sense of unease began to creep in. His GPS struggled to find the location, rerouting multiple times, and the narrow dirt roads seemed to stretch on forever. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the farmhouse came into view. It was an old, decrepit structure, its paint peeling and windows clouded with grime. The porch light flickered weakly, barely illuminating the front steps. The surrounding fields were eerily silent, not even a whisper of wind or the chirp of crickets. Ryan parked his van and grabbed the package, a small, unmarked box wrapped in brown paper. As he approached the porch, he noticed something strange. The air felt heavier, almost oppressive, and the faint scent of something metallic lingered in his nostrils. He shrugged it off and placed the package on the porch, just as the instructions said. Knock, knock. The sound echoed unnaturally in the stillness. Ryan turned to leave but stopped when he heard the faint creak of the front door. Against his better judgment, he glanced back. The door was slightly ajar, revealing nothing but darkness inside. Hello? Ryan called out, his voice wavering. No response. He stepped back, preparing to leave, but something on the porch caught his eye. The package he had just delivered was gone. Ryan's stomach dropped. He hadn't heard anyone open the door, hadn't seen anyone take it. He quickly scanned the area, his flashlight piercing the darkness, but the porch was empty. His hands were trembling now, and he turned to head back to his van. That's when he saw it. Standing at the edge of the field, barely visible in the dim moonlight, was a figure. It was tall and unnaturally thin, its limbs too long, its head tilted at an odd angle. Ryan's breath caught in his throat as the figure raised one hand and pointed directly at him. Ryan didn't wait to see what would happen next. He sprinted to his van, fumbling with the keys before finally getting the door open. He jumped inside, locked the doors, and started the engine. As the van roared to life, he glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. The figure was now standing in the middle of the road, much closer than before. Its head was still tilted, and its face was wrong. The features were blurred as if smeared like wet paint. Ryan couldn't tear his eyes away, even as every instinct screamed at him to drive. Then in a flash, the figure was gone, just like that. 1 second it was there, and the next, the road was empty. Ryan's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He floored the gas pedal, speeding away from the farmhouse as fast as he could. The dirt road seemed endless, but eventually, Ryan reached the main highway. He pulled over to catch his breath, his heart hammering in his chest. He sat there for several minutes, trying to convince himself that it had been a trick of the light, a shadow playing tricks on his mind. But when he looked in the passenger seat, his blood ran cold. The package was there. The same brown paper-wrapped box sitting neatly on the seat as if it had never left the van. His breathing quickened as he reached for it, his hands trembling. He peeled back the paper, revealing a plain wooden box with no markings. Slowly, he opened it. Inside was a photograph. It was a picture of Ryan sitting in his van, taken just seconds ago. In the reflection of the rearview mirror, he saw it again. The figure, standing directly behind him. The next morning, Ryan's van was found abandoned on the side of the highway. The doors were locked, the keys still in the ignition, but Ryan was nowhere to be found. The only thing investigators discovered inside the van was a single photograph showing the empty farmhouse porch and a message scrawled on the back in jagged handwriting, "Delivery complete." The storm came out of nowhere. Emma had been driving back from her parents' house, taking the scenic route through the back roads to avoid the highway traffic. What started as a peaceful evening drive quickly turned into a nightmare as the sky darkened and torrential rain hammered her windshield. Her old sedan struggled against the winds, and the headlights barely pierced the dense wall of water. When the engine sputtered and died, Emma cursed under her breath. Stranded in the middle of nowhere with no cell service, her only option was to seek help. Through the rain-slicked glass, she spotted a faint light in the distance, a house perched on a hill at the end of a dirt path. Reluctantly, she grabbed her coat and stepped into the storm. The walk to the house was grueling. The mud sucked at her boots, and the wind clawed at her like unseen hands. By the time she reached the porch, she was soaked to the bone, her hair plastered to her face. The house loomed before her, its windows glowing faintly. It was old, with warped wooden boards and a sagging roof, but it was shelter. She knocked on the door, the sound echoing hollowly inside. For a moment, there was only silence. Then the door creaked open, revealing a woman in her 60s with a kind if tired face. "Oh dear," the woman said, taking in Emma's soaked appearance. "You're drenched. Come in, come in." Emma stepped inside, grateful for the warmth. The house smelled faintly of wood smoke and something sweet, like lavender. The woman introduced herself as Agnes and led Emma to the living room, where a fire crackled in the hearth. "Sit down, warm yourself up," Agnes said, bustling off to the kitchen. Emma sank into the worn armchair, her muscles finally relaxing. The room was cozy, filled with antique furniture and shelves lined with books. A grandfather clock ticked softly in the corner. As Emma's eyes roamed the room, they landed on an old portrait above the fireplace. It showed a family, a man, a woman, and a young girl. The man's face was stern, the woman's gentle, and the girl looked eerily serious for her age. "That's my family," Agnes said, returning with a steaming cup of tea. Emma jumped, startled by her sudden appearance. "My husband and daughter," Agnes added, her voice wistful. "They're not here?" Emma asked, immediately regretting the question. Agnes's expression darkened and she shook her head. "Not for a long time," she said softly. Emma sipped the tea, hoping to change the subject, but a nagging feeling kept gnawing at her. Something about the house felt off. The air was heavy, and shadows seemed to cling to the corners. She tried to shake it off, blaming her nerves. "Where are you heading?" Agnes asked, breaking the silence. "Just back home. My car broke down," Emma explained. "I'll leave as soon as the storm lets up." Agnes nodded, but there was something in her expression, something unreadable. "You'll stay the night. The storm's too dangerous." Emma hesitated. She didn't want to impose, but the thought of braving the storm again was unbearable. "Thank you," she said finally. As the hours passed, the storm showed no sign of letting up. Agnes retired early, leaving Emma alone in the living room. The fire had burned low, casting flickering shadows across the walls. Emma tried to relax, but the sense of unease only grew. The grandfather clock chimed midnight, its sound reverberating through the house. That's when Emma heard it, a faint, rhythmic creaking coming from upstairs. It sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate. Her heart pounded as she strained to listen. Agnes had said she was the only one in the house, hadn't she? The creaking stopped, and for a moment the house was silent. Then a soft thud echoed from the hallway outside the living room. Emma froze, her breath catching in her throat. Slowly, she turned toward the doorway. Standing there, barely visible in the dim light, was a girl. She looked to be about 10 years old, her hair hanging in damp strands around her pale face. She wore a tattered nightgown, and her bare feet were caked with mud. The girl stared at Emma, her expression blank. "Are you lost?" Emma managed to whisper, her voice trembling. The girl didn't respond. She took a step forward, then another, her movements unnaturally jerky. Emma's instincts screamed at her to run, but she couldn't move. The girl stopped a few feet away, tilting her head to one side. "They don't like it when you stay," the girl said in a hollow voice. Before Emma could respond, the girl turned and walked away, vanishing into the darkness of the hallway. Emma sat there, paralyzed with fear, until a loud crash shattered the silence. It came from upstairs. Against her better judgment, Emma grabbed the flashlight from her coat pocket and headed up the stairs. The wooden steps groaned under her weight, and the air grew colder with each step. At the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched before her, its walls lined with old photographs. At the far end, a door stood ajar. The crash had come from there. Emma approached the door slowly, her flashlight trembling in her hand. When she pushed it open, the beam illuminated a small bedroom. The furniture was covered in white sheets, and the wallpaper was faded and peeling. In the center of the room, the girl stood with her back to Emma, staring at the floor. "Are you okay?" Emma asked, her voice barely audible. The girl turned slowly, and Emma gasped. The girl's eyes were gone, empty sockets staring back at her. Blood trickled down her face as she raised a hand, pointing at the corner of the room. Emma turned the flashlight toward the corner and screamed. Agnes stood there, her face twisted into a grotesque grin. Her hands were clawed, her eyes gleaming with malice. "You shouldn't have stayed," she hissed, her voice echoing unnaturally. The flashlight flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. Emma's screams echoed through the house, but no one was around to hear them. When the storm passed the next morning, the house was empty. Emma's car was still on the dirt road, but there was no sign of her. Locals later claimed that no one had lived in that farmhouse for decades, not since the family that once lived there had vanished under mysterious circumstances. Some say the house takes those who enter, and the storm always ensures there's someone new. Jenna's new job as a night security guard seemed easy enough. The old office building was mostly empty at night, save for the occasional late working executive. Her duties were straightforward: patrol the floors, check the cameras, and log any incidents. The building itself, however, had a reputation. The staff whispered about strange occurrences: objects moving on their own, lights flickering, and voices echoing through the halls. Jenna didn't believe in ghosts or superstitions. She'd rolled her eyes at the rumors during her orientation. Now, on her third night, she was determined to prove that the job was just as mundane as she'd imagined. It was a little after 2 a.m. when the first oddity occurred. Jenna was making her rounds on the 6th floor, where most of the cubicles were located. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly as she walked, her footsteps echoing in the otherwise silent space. Then she heard it, the distinct sound of typing. She stopped, the hair on the back of her neck standing up. The sound was faint, coming from the far end of the office. "Hello?" she called out, her voice wavering. No response. Jenna approached cautiously, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. The typing continued, steady and relentless. As she rounded the corner, her beam landed on a single computer at the end of a row of desks. Its monitor glowed faintly, the screen filled with gibberish, a mess of symbols and letters rapidly scrolling as if someone were typing at lightning speed. No one was there. Jenna's stomach churned. She reached out and touched the keyboard. The moment her fingers made contact, the typing stopped and the screen went black. The silence that followed was deafening. Shaking off her unease, she finished her patrol and returned to the security office. She rewound the camera footage, hoping to catch whoever had been at the desk, but the feed showed nothing. Just an empty office, the computer silent and dark the entire time. Her shift dragged on, the unease gnawing at her. Around 3:15 a.m., the cameras flickered. Jenna sat upright, staring at the monitors as static filled the screens. One by one, they snapped back into focus, except for the feed from the lobby. The lobby camera displayed something that made Jenna's blood run cold. A figure stood in the center of the room facing the camera. It was tall and shrouded in shadow, its features impossible to discern. The figure didn't move, didn't shift, just stood there, staring. Jenna grabbed her flashlight and headed for the lobby, her heart pounding. The elevator ride felt interminable, the soft ding of each passing floor heightening her anxiety. When the doors opened to the lobby, it was empty. The stillness was oppressive, the air heavy. Her flashlight beam swept the room, but there was no sign of the figure. She checked every corner, every shadow, and found nothing. As she turned to head back to the elevator, she noticed something on the floor near the center of the room. A single wet footprint. Jenna stared at it, her breath catching in her throat. The footprint was barefoot, impossibly large, and pointed toward the elevator. She shivered and hurried back to the security office, vowing to ride out the rest of her shift behind locked doors. But the night wasn't done with her. At 4:30 a.m., Jenna heard the sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate footsteps coming from the hallway outside the office. She froze, her hand hovering over the phone to call for help. The steps grew louder, closer, until they stopped just outside the door. Her heart raced as she stared at the knob, waiting for it to turn. The handle jiggled once, then twice. Jenna jumped to her feet, gripping her flashlight like a weapon. "Who's there?" she shouted, her voice trembling. Silence. The handle jiggled again, harder this time, as if someone or something was trying to force its way in. Jenna backed away, her eyes darting to the cameras. On the monitors, every single feed showed the same thing. The dark figure from the lobby, standing in each location simultaneously, staring directly into the cameras. The handle stopped moving. Jenna's breathing was ragged, her chest tight. Then slowly, the lights in the security office began to flicker. One by one, the bulbs went out, plunging the room into darkness. Jenna's flashlight flickered to life, casting a shaky beam around the room. She turned toward the door and stopped dead. The figure was standing inside the office, mere feet from her. Its face was a void, a swirling mass of darkness where features should have been. Jenna screamed and swung her flashlight, but it passed through the figure as if it were smoke. The last thing she remembered was the overwhelming cold as the figure reached out and placed a shadowy hand on her chest. Her vision blurred, her screams fading into silence. When the morning guard arrived to relieve Jenna, they found the security office empty. The monitors were off, the chair overturned. Jenna's belongings were still there, but she was nowhere to be found. Later, when the building manager reviewed the security footage, he saw something chilling. At exactly 4:33 a.m., the feed from every camera flickered to static. When it resumed, the dark figure was standing at the front entrance, holding the door open as if inviting someone inside. Jenna's face was never seen again. But every now and then, late at night, the sixth-floor computer flickers to life, filling its screen with gibberish. And on the monitors, that shadowy figure still appears, staring, waiting. It was Tom's first night at the gas station, covering the graveyard shift for some extra cash. The station was a lonely outpost on a desolate stretch of highway surrounded by dense woods. His manager had given him the usual spiel: restock the shelves, clean the bathrooms, and keep an eye on the pumps. "It's a quiet job," the manager had said with a grin, "unless the regulars show up." Tom had laughed it off, assuming it was a joke. But now, sitting alone behind the counter at 2:12 a.m., he couldn't shake the eerie feeling that had settled over the station. The fluorescent lights hummed faintly, and the wind howled outside, rattling the glass doors. He tried to focus on his phone, scrolling through endless memes to pass the time. The bell above the door chimed. Tom looked up, startled. He hadn't heard a car pull up. A man stood in the doorway, dripping wet as if he'd been caught in a downpour, though the night had been dry. He was tall, wearing a tattered coat, and his face was obscured by shadows. The man didn't move, just stood there, staring. Can I help you?" Tom called out, trying to sound confident. The man tilted his head, then slowly shuffled inside. His footsteps were heavy, and Tom noticed his boots left muddy prints on the pristine tile floor. The man wandered to the back of the store, his movements jerky, almost mechanical. He stopped in front of the refrigerated drinks, standing perfectly still. Tom felt a chill creep up his spine. Something about the man was wrong. After a few moments, the man turned and began walking toward the counter. His face came into view under the harsh fluorescent light, and Tom's stomach churned. The man's eyes were cloudy, his skin unnaturally pale, and his lips were cracked and blue. "Are you okay, sir?" Tom asked, gripping the edge of the counter. The man didn't answer. Instead, he raised a shaking hand and pointed to the window behind Tom. Tom glanced over his shoulder at the darkened parking lot. At first, he saw nothing. Then, just beyond the glow of the station's lights, he noticed movement, shadows darting between the trees at the edge of the woods. His heart raced as he squinted, trying to make sense of the shapes. When he turned back to the counter, the man was gone. Tom jumped to his feet, looking around frantically. The store was empty. The muddy footprints stopped abruptly in the middle of the aisle, as if the man had vanished into thin air. Tom's pulse pounded in his ears as he backed up toward the counter, his hand brushing against the emergency phone. The bell above the door chimed again. Tom whipped around. A woman stood in the doorway this time, wearing a white dress that was stained with dirt. Her hair hung limply over her face, and her bare feet left wet smudges on the floor. She stepped inside, her head jerking slightly with each movement. "Ma'am?" Tom stammered, his voice trembling. "Do you need help?" The woman raised her head, revealing hollow sockets where her eyes should have been. Her mouth opened impossibly wide, but no sound came out. Instead, a faint scratching noise filled the air, growing louder and louder until Tom clapped his hands over his ears. Suddenly, the store's lights flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. The scratching stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence. Tom fumbled for his flashlight, his hands shaking so badly it took him 3 tries to turn it on. The beam of light swept the store, revealing empty aisles and overturned shelves. The woman was gone. The only sound was the soft hum of the refrigerators, which had somehow stayed on. Tom's flashlight landed on the window behind the counter. and he froze. Outside, in the dim glow of the station's lights, a crowd of figures stood at the edge of the parking lot. Men, women, and children, all with blank, expressionless faces and lifeless eyes. Their heads tilted in unison, watching him. One by one, they began walking toward the store. Tom panicked. He locked the front door and grabbed the emergency phone, but the line was dead. The figures pressed against the glass, their pale hands smearing the surface as they stared inside. The bell above the door chimed again, though no one had opened it. The air grew colder, and Tom's breath came out in visible puffs. He backed away, clutching his flashlight like a weapon. The figures outside began banging on the glass, their hands thudding in an eerie, rhythmic pattern. The flashlight flickered and went out. Tom screamed as the banging intensified, the sound echoing in his ears. The door rattled violently, and he could hear the bell chiming over and over, as if mocking him. He stumbled toward the back of the store, his heart hammering in his chest. Then everything stopped. The lights flickered back on, the banging ceased, and the store was eerily silent. Tom crept back toward the counter, his legs trembling. The parking lot was empty. No figures, no footprints, nothing but the wind rustling the trees. Tom quit his job the next morning, leaving without explanation. He never told anyone what he saw that night. But locals still whisper about the gas station on the highway and how strange things happen after dark. And if you're ever there late at night, some say you can still hear the bell chiming, even when no one is there. The town of Black Hollow was infamous for its abandoned hospital, a massive Gothic structure that had been left to decay for decades. Officially, the hospital had closed in the 1970s due to funding issues, but locals whispered of darker reasons: patients disappearing, experiments gone wrong, and the screams that supposedly echoed through the halls long after it was shuttered. Jared and his friends thought it would be the perfect place to explore on Halloween night. Armed with flashlights, cameras, and a thirst for adrenaline, they climbed over the rusted fence and entered through a broken side door. The air inside was cold, carrying the faint scent of mildew and rot. Graffiti lined the crumbling walls, and the floor was littered with broken glass and debris. Their footsteps echoed unnaturally, as if the building were amplifying the sound. "This place is creepy as hell," Taylor muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. "Exactly why we're here," Jared replied with a grin, trying to mask his own unease. The group wandered through the main hall, past empty nurses' stations and rusted wheelchairs. Every creak of the floorboards and distant drip of water set their nerves on edge. Jared led the way, emboldened by the bravado of being on camera. "Let's find the psych ward," he suggested. "That's where the real ghosts will be." Reluctantly, the others followed. The deeper they went, the darker and colder the air became. Their flashlights struggled to pierce the oppressive blackness, and the graffiti gave way to peeling paint and sinister stains. The psych ward was on the 3rd floor, marked by a set of heavy iron-barred doors. Jared pushed them open with a loud groan. Inside, the ward felt even more oppressive. Rows of tiny padded cells lined the walls, their doors hanging ajar. The group split up to explore, their flashlights darting nervously across the walls and ceilings. "Guys," Taylor called from one of the cells, "you need to see this." They gathered around her, peering into the tiny room. The padding on the walls had been torn to shreds, revealing scrawled words underneath. "Don't let them in." The writing was uneven, frantic, as if carved with desperate hands. "It's just graffiti," Jared said, though his voice lacked conviction. A loud crash echoed down the hall, and everyone froze. "What was that?" Mia whispered, clutching her flashlight tightly. "Probably just something falling," Jared said, though he didn't move to investigate. The group stood in tense silence, listening. A faint sound drifted through the air, a low, guttural moan that made their skin crawl. "Okay, I'm done. Let's go," Taylor said, backing toward the door. As they turned to leave, the lights on their cameras began to flicker. The temperature plummeted, their breath visible in the cold air. Jared's flashlight flickered, then went out entirely. "Stay close," he said, his bravado now completely gone. The moaning grew louder, joined by a faint whispering that seemed to come from all directions. The group huddled together, their flashlights flickering erratically. Shadows began to move along the walls, twisting and writhing like living things. "Run!" Mia screamed. They bolted for the exit, their footsteps echoing wildly through the halls. Jared led the way, but every turn seemed to lead them deeper into the hospital. The shadows followed, growing darker and more defined. Human-like shapes emerged from the walls, their faces twisted into grotesque masks of agony. Taylor tripped, her scream cutting through the air as she hit the ground. Jared turned back, grabbing her arm and pulling her to her feet. The others were already ahead, their flashlights bobbing in the darkness. Finally, they reached the main hall. The broken side door was in sight, a sliver of moonlight spilling through the gap. They burst outside, gasping for breath, and didn't stop running until they were clear of the fence. For a moment, they stood in silence, their chests heaving. "What the hell was that?" Taylor gasped, tears streaming down her face. "No idea," Jared replied, his voice shaking. He glanced back at the hospital, half expecting to see something following them. The building loomed in the moonlight, silent and still. But as they watched, a single light flickered on in one of the windows, a faint, eerie glow. Then another, and another. The entire hospital seemed to come alive, every window illuminated by the same sickly light. Figures appeared in the windows, staring out at them with hollow, empty eyes. "Go," Jared shouted, and they fled to their car, speeding away from Black Hollow as fast as they could. Later, when Jared reviewed the footage from his camera, his blood ran cold. The video was mostly static, but in the brief moments of clarity, he saw them, the shadowy figures, their faces twisted in torment, reaching for the group. And in the last frame, as they fled through the side door, something was watching them from the shadows, something with glowing eyes. Casey had been working as a janitor for years, bouncing between buildings and night shifts without complaint. When she got assigned to the old city library, she was told the same thing every new hire heard. Don't go into the basement after midnight. The library was massive, its towering shelves filled with dusty, forgotten books that hadn't been borrowed in years. Casey thought the warnings about the basement were just another workplace joke, like tales of haunted copy machines or phantom patrons. She shrugged it off, determined to do her job and get out before dawn. Her first night went smoothly. She cleaned the bathrooms, mopped the marble floors, and polished the grand chandeliers. The place had an eerie charm, its stained glass windows casting colorful patterns across the empty reading rooms. By the second night, Casey was already comfortable with the creaks and groans of the old building. It wasn't until her third shift that things took a turn. Casey was finishing up the upper floors when she noticed the lights in the basement stairwell were on. She frowned. The head librarian, a frail woman named Mrs. Redding, had mentioned that no one had been downstairs in months. Supplies were stored there, but it was off-limits for staff. Maybe someone had left the lights on during the day. Or maybe one of the other workers was playing a prank. Either way, she grabbed her flashlight and headed down, determined to prove she wasn't scared of a few old stairs. The air grew colder with every step, and a faint, musty smell filled her nostrils. The basement was a sprawling maze of storage rooms, its walls lined with crumbling shelves and boxes of forgotten books. Her flashlight beam danced across the shadows as she walked, her footsteps echoing in the silence. Then she heard it, a faint whisper, so soft she almost thought she'd imagined it. Casey stopped, her flashlight trembling slightly in her hand. "Hello?" she called, her voice wavering. The whispering stopped. She waited, her heart pounding, but the only response was the hum of the building's ancient heating system. She shook her head and laughed nervously. "Get it together," she muttered, turning to leave. That's when the lights went out. Complete darkness swallowed her, save for the narrow beam of her flashlight. Casey cursed under her breath, fumbling for her radio to call for help. But before she could switch it on, she heard the whispering again. Louder this time, coming from deeper in the basement. It wasn't just one voice. It was several, overlapping in a discordant murmur. The words were indecipherable, but the tone was unmistakably urgent, almost pleading. Casey's mouth went dry as she backed away, her flashlight flickering. The beam landed on a door at the end of the hall, a door that hadn't been there a moment ago. It was old and wooden, with strange symbols carved into its surface. The whispering grew louder as she approached, her legs moving almost against her will. The doorknob was ice cold when she touched it, and the moment she turned it, the whispers stopped. The door swung open, revealing a room unlike anything Casey had ever seen. It was massive, far larger than the basement could possibly contain, its walls lined with ancient books bound in cracked leather. Candles flickered on wrought iron sconces, casting eerie shadows across the room. In the center stood a large circular table. its surface engraved with intricate runes. On the table lay a book, its cover made of something dark and shiny, something that looked disturbingly like stretched, tanned skin. Casey's instincts screamed at her to leave, but she couldn't resist the pull of the room. She stepped inside, her footsteps echoing unnaturally. As she approached the table, the air grew heavier, pressing down on her chest like an invisible weight. Her hand hovered over the book, trembling. Just as her fingers brushed the cover, a loud, guttural voice boomed from the shadows. "Leave!" Casey screamed and stumbled back, the book falling open with a deafening thud. The pages were filled with bizarre symbols and grotesque illustrations, but what made her blood run cold was the sound, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from the book itself. The room began to shake, the candles flickering wildly. Shadows on the walls twisted and writhed, forming grotesque shapes that reached for her. Casey turned and ran, slamming the door behind her. But the whispers didn't stop. They followed her as she raced up the stairs, growing louder, more insistent. By the time she reached the main floor, she was sobbing, her flashlight long forgotten. When she burst outside into the crisp night air, the whispers finally ceased. The library stood behind her, dark and silent, as if nothing had happened. Casey never went back to work. She tried to warn the staff, but no one believed her. "The basement is just storage," they said with knowing smiles. "Nothing to be afraid of." Weeks later, a new janitor took over Casey's shift. On their first night, they heard the whispers too. By the end of the week, they were gone, disappeared without a trace. The library remains open, its basement sealed and forgotten. But locals say that if you stand outside late at night, you can hear faint whispers drifting through the air, and sometimes, just sometimes, the old wooden door appears again. Dave had been a delivery driver for years, working the graveyard shift in a sleepy rural town. The roads were long and empty, flanked by endless fields and thick woods. It was lonely work, but he didn't mind, until one night when he got a delivery to a place he'd never heard of. Hollow Brook Lodge. The address didn't show up on his GPS, so he called the customer. A soft, breathy voice answered, giving him vague directions. "Take the old highway out past the forest. You'll see a gravel road. Follow it all the way to the lodge." Dave felt uneasy, but figured it was just some recluse who liked their privacy. The order was simple, a stack of pizzas and 2-liter sodas. Easy enough. He loaded up the car and started driving. The old highway was darker than usual that night, the stars obscured by thick clouds. Dave turned off the main road and onto the gravel path as instructed. His tires crunched loudly on the stones, and the woods seemed to close in around him. The deeper he drove, the more isolated he felt. His headlights barely pierced the darkness, and the air felt heavier, colder. After what felt like forever, he saw it, Hollow Brook Lodge. It was a sprawling, decrepit building with sagging walls and boarded-up windows. The paint was peeling, and the front porch leaned precariously to one side. A dim yellow light flickered in one of the windows. The sight of it made Dave's stomach churn, but he was already here, and he needed the tip. He parked, grabbed the pizzas, and made his way to the front door. The wooden steps creaked under his weight, and the air smelled of damp rot. He knocked once, then twice. No answer. "Hello?" he called out. "Delivery." The door creaked open on its own. Dave hesitated. Your food's here," he said, stepping inside. The interior was worse than the outside. The walls were covered in faded, water-damaged wallpaper, and the floorboards groaned with every step. A faint metallic smell lingered in the air. "Hello," he called again, louder this time. From somewhere upstairs came the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps. Dave set the pizzas on a nearby table, his nerves jangling. "I'm just going to leave these here," he said, his voice trembling. "Thanks for your order." He turned to leave, but something caught his eye. A framed photo on the wall, hanging slightly crooked. It was black and white, showing a group of people standing in front of the lodge. They were dressed in old-fashioned clothes, their faces oddly expressionless. What made Dave pause was the date scrawled in the corner. 1923. A cold chill ran down his spine. That couldn't be right. The footsteps above grew louder, as if someone or something was coming down the stairs. Dave didn't wait to find out who it was. He bolted for the door, slamming it behind him as he ran to his car. His heart pounded as he fumbled with his keys, finally getting the engine to start. As he sped down the gravel road, he glanced in his rearview mirror and froze. A figure stood on the porch, illuminated by his taillights. It was tall and gaunt, its face obscured by shadows, but its eyes, they glowed faintly, like dim embers, watching him until he disappeared down the road. Dave didn't stop until he reached the main highway. His hands were shaking so badly he had to pull over to catch his breath. He tried to call the number from the order, but the line was disconnected. When he checked his GPS again, the route to Hollowbrook Lodge was gone, replaced by blank fields. The next day, Dave told his manager about the strange delivery. They checked the records, but there was no such address in the system. The manager brushed it off as a prank, but Dave couldn't shake the feeling that what he'd seen was real. A few weeks later, he decided to look up Hollowbrook Lodge online. What he found made his blood run cold. The lodge had burned down in the 1930s, killing everyone inside. Locals claimed it was cursed, that the spirits of the guests still lingered, waiting for unsuspecting visitors. Dave never worked night shifts again. But sometimes, late at night, he dreams of the lodge, of the glowing eyes, and of the faint, ghostly voice whispering from his back seat, "You forgot the tip." Jake was a security guard working the night shift at Edgewood Storage, a sprawling facility on the outskirts of town. His job was straightforward: patrol the grounds, monitor the cameras, and ensure no one tried to break into the units. He liked the solitude and spent most nights drinking coffee and watching movies on his phone in the small office. The facility was eerie at night, the rows of storage units stretching into the darkness. The flickering overhead lights cast long shadows, and the place was often dead silent, save for the occasional gust of wind. One night, as Jake was watching the monitors, something caught his eye. On the screen for Unit 237, he saw movement. A tall, thin man stood in front of the unit, his back to the camera. Jake frowned. There weren't supposed to be any customers around after hours. Grabbing his flashlight, Jake headed out to investigate. As he walked between the rows of units, the wind seemed to pick up, carrying an odd smell like damp earth. He found Unit 237 and stopped in his tracks. The man was still there, standing perfectly still, facing the locked unit. "Hey," Jake called out, "this is private property. You're not supposed to be here." The man didn't respond. Jake's flashlight beam caught the edges of his clothes, tattered, dark, and damp looking, as if he'd been caught in the rain. But there hadn't been any rain. Jake approached cautiously, his hand hovering over the baton on his belt. "Sir, I need you to leave," he said more firmly. The man turned his head slowly, unnaturally. When Jake saw his face, his blood ran cold. The man's eyes were sunken and empty, his skin a sickly gray, and his mouth stretched into a twisted grin. His neck cracked audibly as he completed the turn, staring straight at Jake. "Why did you lock it?" the man rasped, his voice like dry leaves. "Let it out." Jake stumbled back, his flashlight shaking. "What are you talking about?" he stammered. The man didn't answer. Instead, he reached out and placed his hand on the lock of Unit 237. The padlock snapped open with a loud clang, though Jake hadn't seen him use a key. The door rolled up with a groan, revealing a pitch-black interior. Before Jake could react, the man stepped inside and vanished into the darkness. Jake's instincts screamed at him to run, but curiosity got the better of him. He shone his flashlight into the unit, illuminating dusty boxes and broken furniture. The beam flickered, and he thought he saw something move in the corner, a shadow shifting where there shouldn't have been one. Then he heard it, a low, guttural growl, followed by the sound of something dragging across the concrete floor. Jake's heart pounded as he backed away, the flashlight beam trembling. A figure emerged from the shadows, hunched and grotesque. Its skin was stretched tightly over its bones, and its limbs were unnaturally long, tipped with sharp claws. Its head cocked to the side, revealing glowing yellow eyes and a mouth filled with jagged teeth. The creature let out a deafening screech and lunged at Jake. He turned and ran, his boots pounding against the concrete as the creature's claws scraped the floor behind him. He could feel its hot breath on his neck, hear its inhuman snarls. Reaching the office, he slammed the door shut and locked it, leaning against it as he gasped for breath. The growling stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then the monitors flickered. Jake turned to look at the screens. One by one, the cameras shut off, replaced by static. On the last working screen, he saw the creature standing outside the office door, its yellow eyes fixed on the camera. It raised a clawed hand and scratched 3 long marks across the lens, leaving a jagged black smear. The power went out. Jake grabbed his phone and called the police, his hands trembling so badly he almost dropped it. When they arrived, they found him huddled in the corner of the office, pale and shaking. The officers searched the facility but found no sign of the man, the creature, or any disturbance at Unit 237. The lock was intact and the contents were untouched. Jake quit that night. He never spoke about what he saw, but other guards who took over his shift reported strange occurrences. Claw marks appearing on the doors, eerie growls echoing through the facility, and the lights in Unit 237 flickering on and off. The storage company eventually sealed off Unit 237 entirely, claiming it was due to structural issues. But the rumors persist, and locals say if you're brave enough to stand outside the facility at night, you can still hear scratching sounds coming from inside.